Yay! I think we're live. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for being part of the early access. We really appreciate it. And thanks for sending in questions. We would love to have more questions next week. So do send in more questions and try to send video questions if you want to. And yeah, let's just get started with the questions. So the first question is by Eugene, and he asks, are we going to cover Redux in the context of iOS apps? Matt, do you want to answer it?
Sure. Sort of is the answer. What we're actually going to be covering is Elm. And if you don't know the history of Redux, Redux was actually an effort to blend some of the ideas from the Flux framework and Elm together. Elm also uses a very similar state reducer pipeline. And so most of the ideas from Redux are in Elm. And so we won't be covering Redux exactly, but the same ideas about state and about managing your views constructed and presented, from that state will be covered.
Awesome, thanks. And then we have maybe a few shorter questions. So first of all, Eugene also asks, are we going to talk about making the data store independent of the application? So for example, decoupling the application from core data or from JSON or whatever. Florian, what do you think?
So that's actually something that we experimented with very early on when we started to write this book, or not even write it yet, just play around with some ideas. And we did different implementations of our persistence layer and thought that this is actually a good topic for the book, but we realized that it had very little impact on what you would call these architectural patterns that we wanted to describe. So we decided to not cover this in the book because, you can just use very different technologies on the persistence layer without a big impact on the rest. But that's something we might pick up as a suggestion for either future Swift Talk episodes, or maybe we will also do something in this direction in the videos that we will produce for the book.
The next question, Matt, does the app have a real-world example, or does the book have a real-world example? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the book is built around 6 implementations of an app that we just call Recordings, but it's a voice memos app. And most of the versions of those are just voice memos that you save on the device. But we also have networked versions of the app that store it on a remote server and use audio streaming. So I think, yes, there are examples of real-world things that you might need to do in there. And absolutely, it's written out as a concrete app. We're not simply speaking in abstract terms the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a small app, but still, we try to show as many things as we can without making the app too complicated. Then multiple people so Dan and Nikita and some other people asked, are we going to release a paper book? And yes, we will, but not before everything is ready, of course. It's pretty hard to send updates. We would have to send you letters or something. And we don't take pre-releases for the paper book, because then we would have to find some way to send it ourselves, which is not something we're very good at. So we'd rather let Amazon do that and let them take care of the shipping and everything, because they do a much better job at it than we could ever.
Yeah. So basically, we plan to start offering a paperback version around the end of April or May, something like that, when we are when we have finalized the book.
Yes. Another question is by Sahara108, and they ask if we can review their application. They build an application using MVVM, and if we can review it. So Florian, what do you think?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have the time to look into projects and to I don't know, give an opinion on the architecture or on the approach. We would love to do it, but we really can't at this point.
And here's a question for both of you. Maybe Matt, you can start. The question is, are we going to cover Viper, and is it a good idea to ignore it completely? And yeah, what do you think, Matt?
Yeah, a number of people have asked this question. I think Viper is possibly the most used, or possibly the top one or two most used patterns that we're not going to cover in the book. You know, the biggest reason why we didn't, well, we did implement a version of the app in Viper, and we didn't have a whole lot of fun with it. We didn't think the ideas from Viper played well with some of the other patterns. You know, one of the main purposes of the book is to encourage mixing and matching between patterns. And Viper has some very strong principles that don't play well with that idea. To incorporate any other idea is to kind of break Viper's principles. But in a more general sense, you know, looking at whether or not we think Viper is the best way forward, Viper is very inflexible. It suggests a very strict set of transformations between the model and the view, and it encourages you to implement these using specific classes and using specific techniques from start to finish. And it resists the idea of collapsing it down and making it simpler. And we think that you should, you know, try to build your app in a simpler way. And that doesn't mean unable to scale. That just means that you should try to express that transformation between the underlying view and, the underlying model and the view as simply as possible, and not force yourself every time to go through 3 levels of indirection between the view and the model. So, no, we didn't choose to do Viper. You know, it's sort of hard to answer this question. We don't want to be mean to anyone who likes Viper and is attached to the pattern. There's nothing catastrophically wrong with it, but you know, that's our position.
Florian, do you have anything to add? Or
so I was actually the one who was working on the Viper version of the sample project, and I think it's important to stress that it's by excluding it from the patterns we are going to cover in the book, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the wrong pattern for you. So it might be the right abstraction for some use case, but we felt that in the context of the book, you could argue that, for example, MVVM with a coordinator already goes a little bit in the same direction, right? Because it puts an additional layer between the model and the view controller, so the view model, and it has the coordinator, which takes over other responsibilities that the view controllers have. So it already enforces more structure on you, or it suggests more structure than plain MVC does. And so Viper is just a much more extreme step in the same direction. And that's also one of the reasons why we felt to spend our time on other patterns that have different things to teach than putting in additional layers is time better spent. Yeah.
So 2 more short questions. Oh, go ahead.
Well, no, actually, perhaps we should move on. You can talk for a long time, and I don't think we'd end up saying much more than what we've said already.
Yes. Okay, so two more short questions. Is there a list of all the architectures we considered? Multiple people asked this. No, there is no list. We have a bunch of implementations that we did, and then there's a whole bunch of architectures we didn't even implement, but we of course thought about. We don't have a definitive list, and we probably won't put anything like that in the book. And another question, which is, we could talk about it for a very long time, also shortly. and multiple people asked us what is the best pattern. And sometimes the question is phrased differently. What is the best pattern for my app, which is very large? And I think the whole premise of the book is that we cannot answer this. So we can look at different patterns, but then you have to decide yourself what is best for you. And when we say you, we mean you as a person, and you as a team, and you as a company. There are so many factors that are at play there. One thing we can say is that it's possible to write nice and clean code in every architecture, but some require a bit more discipline than others. So now, Matt, there's a long question for you, I think. So Ashton asks, what do we think about MVP? And also, he has two more questions. How about reactive programming? It seems that some of our architecture implementations lean up on reactive programming. What if you don't want to use it? And can we use things like KVO or just messages or notifications? And at the same time, what about MVVM? We show MVVM with RX. And what if you wanted to use it without RX? So it's a bit of a long question, but let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So yes, there is a lot of reactive programming in some of the patterns in the book. I think we use it in 2 of the patterns. Our MVVM architecture uses RX Swift, and the model adapter view binder uses my CWL signal library. So I'm personally a big fan of reactive programming, and this gets into the idea of, well, what's the best architecture? Some people like reactive programming and some people don't. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be a divide. If you don't like reactive programming, yes, in most cases, you can replace it with notifications or KVO or just imperatively pushed transformation pipelines. Yes, you can. The idea behind reactive programming is you're trying to express that as succinctly as possible. But in making it succinct, yes, it gets more confusing to read, and if people aren't used to it, you're going to confuse them. Absolutely. But there was the question of, are we going to do MVP? Well, actually, that factors into reactive programming a little bit. If you take an MVVM program and you take away all of the reactive programming from it, so you don't bind the presentation model to the views using reactive programming, you instead push it through a protocol boundary, and the view then, the view or the view controller apply it directly to the views, you basically end up with MVP. There's not a huge difference between MVVM minus bindings, minus reactive programming, and MVP. They're almost exactly the same thing. But at the other end, there's not a huge difference between MVP, Model View Presenter, and MVC, Coco's Model View Controller, except that Model View Presenter requires that there be a protocol boundary between the actual presentation logic and the view. Ordinarily in MVC, those things are allowed to intermingle, and there's no clear boundary that you can test on. Sorry, I'm going to flip that notification out of the way. There's no clear protocol boundary for testing on. So people use MVP because it's basically MVC, but you have this clean protocol boundary that you can test along, and you can sort of define your logic that way. So there's a smooth continuum, I guess, between MVC, insert a protocol boundary layer, and you have MVP, insert reactive programming, and you have MVVM. And you can think about it that way, and you sort of choose where you want to live on that continuum based on whether or not you think that protocol boundary layer is important to you, and whether or not you want to include reactive programming. And then there's another step, because we included reactive programming in our MVVM architecture, not just between the outside interface of the presentation model and the view, but also internally to transform from the model objects to the presentation representation. So you could exclude reactive programming from that as well and find a different point on the continuum. And I think we'll try to talk about these things in the book. They are all relevant, and it's important to understand that you can pick a different point on this line based on what you want.
Maybe one other thing about reactive programming, which is interesting, is if you have a model or some view state in, for example, MVC, then it's always easy to forget to subscribe maybe to the model. So you would present your initial model value and then you forget to subscribe. And reactive programming, if you do everything reactively, it makes that part a little bit easier. Of course, like you say, at the price of learning reactive programming, and then it might be confusing. But that's maybe another interesting thing to think about when you use reactive programming, and if you can take lessons from that, even if you don't do reactive programming. So I think we should wrap it up. I would love to hear more questions next week, so please send us more questions. Again, thank you for being part of the pre-release, and we'll see you next week, I think. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.